Hey everyone. Yeah, I'm Nate. I'm just going to be handing the ball off. Sorry for. I will try and limit the NFL puns as the day goes. Um, yeah, so I'm really just gonna kind of launch into it. I'd love to start with Sarah asking about the NFL, which for most of this country is kind of an American institution. It is something that many people build their weeks around for a lot of the year. But your team's challenge is growing and expanding fan bases. I'd love just broadly sort of who are you looking at and how are you starting to try and kind of grow an already huge fan base?
Yeah, I mean, to start off, one of the things that always blows my mind is the stat that like 73% of the U.S. population are fans of the NFL. So we definitely feel like we are incredibly lucky to have the number one fan base in the country. But I think the reality is that, the population is changing. What the U.S. looks like is changing. The way people want to engage in sports is changing. And so our group specifically at the NFL is focused with inspiring affinity with essentially the next generation of fan. And that is for us, Latino, women, youth, LGBTQ plus, sort of the intersectionality and the really intentional intersectionality between all of those groups as a way to future-proof the business. And so, the way we go about that is everything from a focus on creating new ways to watch, platforms and formats. It is how we give people the opportunity to engage in sort of the culture around the game. And then it also relies a lot on participation and really getting the next generation of kids out to play, whether that is through a tackle or a flag lens.
I'm going to ask about flag just because that's something that USA Today and the NFL actually recently partnered on. Is we're going to start doing a Super 25 ranking of girls flag football. So we've got a lot of questions for everyone, but I'd love to just touch on girls flag football, and then also how that's leading into the Olympics in 2028, where we will have flag football as an event there.
I think the irony of this is that I am maybe the least athletic person that anyone will ever meet, but I have a deep passion for flag because of all the work that we've done within the space. And the wonderful thing to me about the NFL's investment in flag is that, it really is about creating inclusive and accessible new ways for people to touch our brand. So flag football, obviously, it's a sport that requires no sort of different equipment, no special fields, nothing like that. So it really gives people the opportunity to participate unlike ever before and is a game-changing platform, as you mentioned, for women. So from an NFL perspective, we are invested in everything from the youth space, getting kids involved from the very beginning, introducing them to our sport through flag, right up through to getting girls' high school flag sanctioned across the country to create a meaningful pathway for women to play that extends to collegiate. And then obviously the work that the NFL has done with the International Federation of American Football over the last year or so to get flag on the LA 28 Olympic program is an absolute sort of pinnacle when it comes to what people have to aspire to. So I think, and by the way, we've also done a lot from a marketing perspective around flag, a lot that Jackie and team have done that she can talk to. But I think, the focus on flag is really fundamental to the conversation around expanding our fan base as we move forward.
So I will pivot to Jackie on that and sort of, we're talking about representation and reaching new fans. And I think part of that is storytelling and reflecting these groups kind of in the brand storytelling, but also meeting people kind of on the platforms where they are, which I know is something your team has taken on.
Yeah, and to Sarah's point, I think, and also to your first point about just storytelling, my team, although we work hand in hand with Sarah, I'd say Sarah's team is very much focused on bringing in those new fans, whether they are across those demographics, whereas my team is much more focused on, our casual fans, people who maybe tune in once or twice a Sunday during the regular season, but they're not what we call avid fans. They're not actively engaging and experiencing these touch points that we offer with football. And so when we talk about, for my team, moving our casual fans to more avid fans, one of the ways we do that is through our brand storytelling and our brand advertising. And so my team works on two, I'd say, critical brand spots each year. One that usually launches in preseason to get people excited about the start of the season If you saw it this year, it was This Is Football Country, which is a lot that went into that. But I think what was so exciting about Flag was actually 2 years ago, our Super Bowl brand spot featured an up-and-coming, incredible female flag football player who was the quarterback of the Mexican flag women's team. Her name is Deanna Flores. She's probably everywhere now. If you guys are going to multiple Advertising Week events, I think she's been there. But when we worked with her, nobody really knew who she was, right? But she was this really, really incredible athlete. And so for the NFL, for our CMO, Tim Ellis, to say, we want to showcase not just flag football as an entry point to participation within our Super Bowl time, but to do it, with an incredible athlete who also touches our Latino fan base, and to show that you too can aspire to be Deanna Flores, I think was really the starting point that Sarah's team has now really been able to run with. But it's really this inclusivity, this ability to see yourself in the NFL and in the brand storytelling pieces that we put out there that maybe 5 years ago you couldn't. And so I think that was just such an incredible opportunity. And we worked super close with Hav's team as well, which I'll let Hav talk to, because in addition to women and flag, I'd say that new audience segment is Latino and Hispanic. I don't know, Hav, if you want to jump in. Okay. Curveball to you.
Go, throw for it.
Hav said he'd throw me some curveballs, so this is my first one to him.
So what I would say to that is, what's interesting about the journey that we've been kind of going through the past couple of years is like we're redefining what fan development is, right? So the concept of becoming a casual fan is a totally different proposition than it was 5-10 years ago. And we collectively are doing that in our own ways. One of the key things that Jackie's doing is really creating platforms that allow us to tell broader stories than just a spot, right? This is football country. You'll see different iterations of what that means. And this idea of inclusivity and intersectionality, we actually really take it to heart. You hear those buzzwords from other brands. I'm not going to talk about other brands, but they kind of talk about it, but we do it. How we do it is more of an art than a science, but we are definitely becoming a lot more thoughtful about this idea of inclusivity as we're thinking about it, and also humanizing the football players through that process, because we know that's the connection to create this idea that we call about onboarding these new fans, right? And we're doing that through all these new platforms that we're doing. On my side, from a Latino side, I came in really kind of focused there, and now, as you see in the words of our titles, there's global to it, right? So we're now expanding even beyond that. Why is that happening? Because we know we can grow. We've kind of have market share here in the United States. There's other opportunities elsewhere. We're seeing the demand coming. And now with flag being such a big part of the Olympics in 2028, we need to make sure that there is, healthy appetites for football across the world. I don't know if I answered your questions, but I went through just a narrative right there.
Well, I do want to talk about Brazil and the UK eventually. We will get there. But when it comes to reaching these new fans, you guys mentioned platforms, and I actually thought about different streaming platforms, a slightly different way of looking at it. But I'm curious how the upcoming partnership with Netflix and what the work you guys have done with Nickelodeon, like how have you used these different sort of channels, platforms to try and reach new fans?
I can start with Netflix, and I'll toss it to Sarah on Nickelodeon. But I think accessibility, obviously, to our sport is changing and growing, and we are adapting, right, to how a consumer, wants to watch football. And I think partnering with Netflix this year, it's a 3-year deal around the NFL playing on Christmas Day, is just such an incredible opportunity, because we really want to make sure that we're allowing fans here in the US, but also internationally, which Netflix will be carrying these 2 games internationally on their platforms, which is just kind of crazy. But the ability to continue to consume our product, and Netflix really giving us the opportunity to do that, specifically with what I was saying, our casual fans. And so I think that's one of the things that we continue to do, is look for ways to continue to reach people where they are, so that they can watch our games. I think Nickelodeon is such an interesting partnership that we've really been able to have for the last couple years, and we've done some incredible innovative things with them. So I'll let Sarah sort of talk to that.
Yeah, and I think to Jackie's point, outside of Nickelodeon, just like broadly from an alternative cast perspective, the whole point is that, we are meeting fans where they are, but also that we know the new sports fan expects things that are personalized and expects experiences that are familiar to them. So I think the beauty of an alt cast is that it allows us to introduce football to people through a vernacular that they're familiar with. Nickelodeon is one example of that, and we have also Slime Time shoulder programming that introduces more of the X's and O's to kids. But specifically, what we've been able to do with our alt cast strategy has provided sort of really meaningful and memorable viewing moments for some of these diverse audiences. If I point to Super Bowl last year, there were about 120 million people who tuned into the main Super Bowl broadcast, another 2.5 who tuned into our Spanish language broadcast, and then another 1.5 million that tuned into Nickelodeon. So when you think about the fact that, I'm sure some of those people may have just tuned into the traditional Super Bowl broadcast, but you have to imagine that there are also, parents, children, some of our Spanish-speaking fan base that saw a real place for themselves and a more customized and personalized experience for themselves because of our alt casts. So you have to assume that also brought in incremental viewers that we otherwise wouldn't have had.
I got to ask about Nickelodeon just because I'm so fascinated by this from like a strategic perspective. Are you guys looking at this more as a way to go where kids are? Is it about just having fun? Is it about like using visual signifiers? Like, am I overthinking this? Is it just like, let's do some wild stuff on Nickelodeon? Or
no, I mean, maybe that's the brief. Yeah. No, I do think it's sort of all of the above, right? And I think the other interesting thing about Nickelodeon is it really isn't just for kids. I think it's provided an incredible co-viewing experience for families, and has given parents the opportunity and the permission to feel okay watching a 4-hour game of football with their kids as the game is being explained to them through characters that the kids are familiar with. So a lot of that, there's a lot of testing and learning that happens in this space, especially with Nickelodeon, but I think, there are definitely, there continue to be opportunities that we sort of stumble upon as we're having fun in the process.
And I'll just say really quickly, from our consumer insights team, we know that one of the major barriers to why people don't watch every Sunday is because they are prioritizing doing other things with their friends and their family. And so specifically to Nickelodeon, to be able to say to parents, hey, you can spend time with your family, but you can do it through the lens of football. That's always a focus of ours. Like, no matter what we're doing when we're talking about parents, it's about how do we position it as you can enjoy downtime with your family and your kids, but you can actually do that while you're also engaging with the NFL. So those two things shouldn't be in opposition. They should be something you can do together.
I'm going to kick it back to Javier with Brazil. I'm fascinated by why Brazil. What you learned in this process of starting this, and I'm curious just why that market and what you guys learned.
I didn't start it, but I was invited into that conversation. But I think there was a lot of work on the global team side to find out where there are opportunities and where did they see pent-up fandom, and Brazil was one of them. So I think that was a 2 to 3 year journey to kind of figure that out and set up the operations to make that happen. And you know what? It was a new venture for us, but it was a very successful one, which everybody is like saying, "Wow, we're smart, we did it right." But we went in there trying to understand, how to activate globally but locally at the same time, which is a unique proposition. And that's kind of where I came in. I came in to at least provide a cultural perspective on making sure that we're going in and being sensitive to the cultural nuances that particular city and country were looking for. And the ways we did that is by inviting all the women that won the Olympics a few weeks ago on NBC. It was a Peacock game, and making them part of that process to celebrate, their country. It was about putting Anita at the halftime show, because that had some global appeal, but also that local appeal. And then bringing in people that are fans of that country. So we did our spot that we did with Brazil. We worked with The Weeknd and used his music and launched his new song that was called São Paulo. So it was just nice timing, and it actually exceeded way our expectations when we were thinking about ratings there locally and then also here. And then we also looked at alternative casts within that space. We actually found some YouTubers there called Casa TV and gave them the right to actually broadcast it through their streaming channel, and it outperformed anything that we could think about. So now, as we talk to our partners at YouTube, how do we continue to do things like that is kind of where we're at. We're continuously experimenting and then also learning from that and just building that out. I think Nickelodeon was a bit of an idea, a seed of an idea. Now we're 3 years in. Netflix is, an idea that they've been toying around for a while, and now we're just going to continue to expand. So you're starting to see kind of that understanding of this idea of onboarding continuing in all parts of our strategy.
From sort of a storytelling perspective, I imagine, too, it could be interesting for in Brazil, soccer is a religion. Like even I'd argue much more even than football in this country. It's got to be interesting to be a challenger brand almost suddenly in these new markets.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea that we took on in that concept is lean into that, right? Let's invite the soccer players from that to be a part of that journey. Let's bring in some of their cultural kind of nuances within the spot to kind of show that there's a blend there, that it's not take this sport, this American football sport that you think about, and make it your own. And you see that through the ad that we created.
We'll pick that up because we've talked a bit about expanding the audience. I'd love to dive into sort of how to deepen the engagement. You're identifying these new fans, and then it's what we were talking about earlier about kind of, all right, how do we get someone who samples the game to now become more of a kind of active participant, avid watcher of the brand. Participation's obviously a way of doing it, but I'm curious, and I'll lead with Sarah on this, but I think you all have thoughts on it, is sort of, when these crossover cultural moments happen, Taylor Swift or, whatever with the NFL, how are you guys sort of taking those strategic moments and trying to then convert those fans into being avid watchers?
Yeah, well, I first of all have to start with the fact that my parents think that I single-handedly am responsible for Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce's relationship, and I haven't corrected them about it. I think that, all of everything that we, at the core of what we focus on doing, again, is understanding who these fans are, whether they are new, casual, avid, really making sure that we are focusing on how we speak to them, again, in a way that they're familiar with. And so for us, when we think about Taylor Swift, a lot of people will say to us all the time, that's so amazing. Now you have female fans, as if there was nothing the NFL did before Taylor Swift. And while I recognize that Taylor Swift, an endorsement from her carries significant weight, for years before, there have been very concentrated and focused strategies on how we target women. And a lot of that has been focused on how we shift the narrative away from just shrinking and pinking things and away from having a conversation with women that sounds condescending and is more within the realm of making sure that women see places for themselves in our brand. And that could be on the field through flag participation. That could be through our ads, as Jackie mentioned. That could be through the women that you see that are on the broadcasting teams that are both in the booth and on the sidelines. And so as a holistic ecosystem, I think we've really focused on how we show up in a way that isn't just representation from a female perspective. And then I think specifically when it comes to different tactics, a lot of what we're also focused on is inserting ourselves into those adjacent subcultures and communities, right? So that is where sport intersects fashion and music and gaming and some of the different communities that exist as part of some of these diverse audiences. It's incredibly important that we don't just look at ourselves as a brand that activates for a 4-hour game every Sunday on linear TV, but we are very much in sort of the game of being always on and serving these audiences where they are. And so I think Taylor Swift taught us an important lesson that, the power of one influencer, so to speak, can bring in a lot more fans. We're now focused on making sure that we are most definitely on the front foot to have a lot of these strategic partnerships set up to continue to engage them and to be there with content that allows them to further immerse themselves in the game.
It's really interesting, and I'd love to. You talk about creating all these spaces, et cetera, and listen, we're seeing media right now becoming more and more niche, and people can kind of go and find their own channels, their own platforms, gaming. I'm curious, how are you not just running in a million directions all at once? Like, how are you prioritizing?
I'm going to jump in there. I think it's tough, right? Because we can get very quickly thrown into everything. One of the things is we're trying to create frameworks that allow us to make sure that we're consistently looking at a journey holistically and having some key touch points that we're kind of testing out as we kind of go through that journey. That's one piece. So it's a little bit about creating that muscle as a team. The other one is this idea of making sure that we're consistently doing it, right? Because I think a lot of times we say, hey, we're going to do stuff for women, and then we show up and then we stop. Like, we have to consistently, and that's what this group does. Like, within the what Sarah leads is this idea of having a dedicated focus on women. Like, okay, so what is that going to look like? How are we going to use the resources across the organization to consistently have that conversation? And then we make sure that as Jackie's building those narratives that are all over the place, that it has plugins to that. So it's not just in a silo.
Yeah, and I would say, first and foremost, I'll say a couple things. One, that was clearly not the first time Sarah's been asked about Taylor Swift. Wonderful answer. She's got it down pat. But I think to Hav's point, and honestly, Nate, to your question, we do get pulled in a million directions, if we're being very frank, and we do run at a million miles an hour, but we are consistent. And so no matter what we're doing from a marketing standpoint, we are always thinking about our key demographics. So that's how, we're talking to women or portraying women or trying to connect with women through our social and influencer team. That's always how are we engaging our Latino audience and how are they represented and how are we speaking to them? Specifically sometimes when Sarah's doing work, it's parents, but I think we have really dialed into a couple of key growth spaces. And so no matter what we're working on, and my team honestly does everything. So we do every single event marketing tentpole out there, from preseason to kickoff to draft and Pro Bowl and Combine and Super Bowl, and every single thing that you think the NFL is involved in, my team is doing the marketing for. We're always consulting our growth audiences team. We're staying super connected with them, and we're making sure that whatever we're putting out into market is done through the lens of making sure we're authentic and inclusive and unifying so that these key demographics can see themselves in our work and in our game. And so it is really something that is always on and always top of mind.
I think we're tired, Nate, basically, is the takeaway.
So what I was going to say is that I think the idea of what a marketer is now is a very different one, in the sense that, we are like facilitators, coordinators, integrators, at the same time as being creative and strategic. There's that kind of muscle that we have to, and that's where the young people are at, and that's where the new jobs are at. So we have to shape ourselves in that way too.
So I'm curious if you look at, imagine a young woman who has a Netflix subscription but doesn't have any cable or anything like that, and isn't a big NFL fan, and stumbles upon an NFL broadcast on Netflix, for instance, which I think is absolutely a thing that could happen. Is the idea there that it's representation, or is there more of a kind of concentrated effort of we need to educate these new fan of exactly where they can watch and how they can interact with it? It's more the second one.
Yeah, I mean, I think through any touch point now that we're creating, we're very focused. Hav mentioned this idea of onboarding and a framework. We're really focused on making sure that we're aware of what those moments of inspiration are and exposure to our game for the first time, but then being very almost systematic about how we move them from being exposed and being inspired to then connecting and engaging with our brand on their path to hopefully becoming evangelists and advocates for the brand. And so if you are tuning into a Netflix game and it's the first time you've watched, that definitely isn't the only touch point the NFL will have with you. The surround sound that is built around every single one of our game broadcasts, regardless if they're on linear or streaming, is focused on making sure that there is some sort of like a more personalized experience depending on how you're engaging with the NFL. So that, to Hav's earlier point, I think like that intentional framework is something that we're getting much better at trying to put in place as a guide.
And I will say just like tactically, if we have a new fan who's female who's tuning in on Netflix, what are we showing or airing in our advertising space during that game? Like that is very tactically a question that we're thinking about. Are we airing a spot that Sarah's team has created around flag football because this young girl might be watching for the first time with her family and we want her to get engaged with the sport? Like that is very tactically something that we're thinking about. I will say though, your additional point about just education on where to watch, Sarah touched upon it really, really early on, but obviously it's not just cable anymore. And we know that it's actually surprisingly the education of when to then figure out where. And so a lot of the times when we talk about new windows, so for example, Wednesday is not a typical day that the NFL plays on, and that's Christmas Day this year. It is continuing to reinforce across all of our channels and also in partnership with Netflix, hey, there's football on Wednesday, and then educating after that where you can go find it. But ultimately, the tune in and the ways to watch is a very complicated matrix that we are, I'd say, steadily progressing and getting better at, but still a lot of work to go. But yeah, I jumped in.
The only thing I was going to say is that I think what Jackie was talking about is kind of like that end game, like getting them to watch a game. But as we're thinking about inspiration, we find inspiration in with our consumer products team and fashion. Social is such a big part of that. And what we're starting to think about is like the communities that those things happen at. How do we get into those conversations so then we can kind of lead them into making sure they watch a broadcast with their friends, and then we can make sure that we're communicating the right messages in those. But we're thinking about inspiration. Where do we create community around sport?
Well, I'm curious, but I want to ask the same question about a Brazil or a UK, where you'll see, I think in the UK we've seen there's been kind of, they've become almost cultural events, but it's sort of like a day out for a soccer fan to go have some fun, and they dress up, and it's kind of, but I'm curious how you then take that moment and actually have them become fans. And like, what's the strategy there? The time difference is also a challenge, I imagine, with the UK.
Yeah, I mean, there's a team out there, and there's probably three things. It's participation is key. Second, social, and then our partners. Like, I think we collectively work in those three areas and look at continuing to have season-long, year-long promotions. Just because we don't see the game, because that's what we see, there's a lot of work in making sure that people are playing the game in that country, that our partners are constantly putting out content out there that's telling that story, and social really being that engine of community building.
And I would just one thing to add, and I think this is some of the work that Hav and team have done too. I think the cultural relevance piece and making sure that the NFL is aware, as Hav mentioned, of those cultural nuances across countries and are then educating people on the game through that lens is incredibly important, because we're talking about countries where people aren't born into fandom, right? Like if you are an American, football is part of who you are. It's sort of embedded in the cultural fabric. That's not the case for a lot of these markets, but I think, by communicating and introducing the game to some of these audiences in a way that sort of makes sense to them, and also showing up at key cultural moments throughout the year, it is helpful in terms of developing that fandom and ultimately, leads to moments like we saw in Munich that's featured in one of the spots that Jackie and team put out this year, where you have 100,000 people singing Country Road, most of those people not speaking English as a first language. Like there's something really powerful about the way we've been able to show up, and I think the how we sustain that will really be rooted in both when we show up, where we show up, but also the relevance piece.
It starts running this weekend, actually, so everybody keep an eye out. But you didn't spoil anything. It's an incredible spot, but it's tied to This Is Football Country, which again is inclusivity and representation, and that football country is not boundaries. It is not the U.S. It is a feeling, and it's a community, and it's just different forms of expression about how people find joy through the game, no matter what they're looking for. And so that example of German fans coming out and just this goosebump moment during that live game, I mean, that is football country. It's not U.S., but it's still the NFL.
And this idea of when we think about cultural relevance, it's about these rituals and badges that signify that aspect of fandom. And that's what, in this football country that Jackie worked on, captures that so beautifully across all the spots that she's done.
Guys, thank you so much. And we'll be around to answer some questions as well, but thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah.